Well, welcome to Black History Conversations. We're well now into July, 4th of July today. And we're welcoming Dr. Kurt Henry, who is the director of the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank. Kurt is our partner in a big project that we're working on with Welsh Government funding to facilitate exchange visits. And it was last autumn, winter time, November, when Kurt was able to come to North Wales and join us here. But it's great that we've got to link with you today, Kurt. You're over there in Jamaica, and the rest of us are scattered around the world who are here this afternoon. So with no more ado, Kurt, I'd like to ask you to tell us more then about revivalism in Jamaica. So Dr. Kurt Henry, delighted to join you. Got my colleagues here, especially Gary Preog, Simon Faringo, and myself, Liz Millman. We're from Learning Links International. Got Jackie Pennant from the North Wales Jamaica Society and the Jamaica Wales Alliance, and Robert Moore from a group here in North Wales called Neuren. So thank you very much indeed. Over to you then, Kurt.
Thank you so much, Liz, and the team for having me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to share with you or rather have a discussion with you on the topic of revivalism in Jamaica. Revivalism, to begin, is one of those African-derived religious practices here in the Caribbean, specifically Jamaica. I am particularly pleased to have this discussion today on two main points. One, I am a practitioner of the religious form, and two, there is still a great deal of public awareness that needs to be done in terms of what this particular religious practice is, on the grounds that there are a lot of stereotypes, well, let me say colonial stereotypes that still follow a sort of understanding or misunderstanding of this religious practice. So I'm very much happy to be able to share with you today. Now, before I get into what revivalism is, or rather is not, it is always important for us to begin with Africa, the continent of Africa, as a source and origin in explaining these religious forms. Primarily because our ancestors were taken from the continent, particularly the western and central region of Africa. And we know very well that when they came over via the transatlantic slave trade, they did not come as blank slates. They came as professionals, they came as doctors, lawyers, chiefs, and so on. And they also came with their cultural practices, and in particular, their religious practices. And despite the system of colonialism and enslavement being designed in a way to strip Africans or people of African descent of their cultural and religious practice, in many ways, they were able to maintain their identities through creative and innovative means. And today, revivalism is one such practice that is testament to the resilience of African religious forms and spirituality. Now, I will also, as a matter of context, share with you in a brief way other African-derived religious practices that are found in the Caribbean. Now, I've already mentioned Africa as a source and a point of origin in trying to understand the complexity of these religious forms that we have in the Caribbean that are found nowhere else in the world as a matter of their emergence, right? These religious forms are what we refer to as indigenous practices or folk religious practices, meaning they emerged within and from the people of their origin. So the term revivalism is a term that is used across the globe to describe any sort of social or cultural or religious phenomena that emerged in response to colonialism and also in response to enslavement. So there are revivalisms in North America, even in parts of Europe. There is a revivalism in India, for example. But in this particular case, we're talking about the revivalism in Jamaica. And the product of that is the revival religion. Now, in order to also understand revivalism, we have to understand the cosmology or the spiritual hierarchy of African religious practices. Now, there is a belief in a supreme being within African cosmology that may be male or female. And this supreme being is considered to be the owner of the skies, the source of all existence, the originating power behind the world of spirits and of human life. And of course, this is no different from a Christian understanding of God, being the creator of all, right? But under that supreme being, there are categories of spirits. And one of the common ones that we know about is the ancestral realm, the ancestral spirits. And one of the reasons Africans hold dear the concept of ancestral spirits is that the ancestors are human dead who have already gone through life, who have already faced the pressures and learned the lessons of life. So therefore, these ancestral spirits are in a way imbibed or invoked to answer particular existential questions that we may have in this life, right? And there are scholars who believe that one of the reasons why enslaved Africans really survived the plantation system, facing issues of dehumanization, rape, mutilation, issues of psychological trauma, was that they held closely their spirituality. And when their bodies were shuttled, when their bodies could have been policed and detained and confined and tortured, of course, it is their spirit, the spirit within them, that really kept their sort of memory and cultural identity intact. Now, after the ancestors, which are referred to as the living dead, because although they have transitioned, they are very much present and alive within this realm. And of course, under the ancestors, you have human beings, which are also spiritual entities. There's a quote that we are physical beings having a spiritual experience. And I'm sure in some way, shape, or form, we can all attest to that. And I've spoken about the Middle Passage and that religion was an important part of that um, geography, of that sort of transition or transaction that was taking place. There are accounts of slave worship or worship of enslaved peoples, even on the very ships that brought them here. Now, it is important to discuss the seasoning process that happened on the plantations whether in the Caribbean or in part of North America. And this process really was done to strip the slaves of their identities, whether culturally, religiously, or psychologically. So in this process, they were given new names, they were stripped of their clothing, and of course, this was an attempt to get them acclimatized or assimilated into plantation life. But even though this system of seasoning had its impact, the spirituality of enslaved Africans remained intact. And this is seen throughout the Caribbean with the various forms of African-derived practices that are still practiced today. So in Brazil, for example, and these are just some examples of spiritual practices in particular areas of the Caribbean. In Brazil, there are practices known as candomblé, umbanda, zango, and batik. In Haiti, we know very well the spiritual practice of voodoo or voodoo. In Cuba, for example, there is the practice of Santeria, Ocha, Palo Mayombe. And in revival, there are the religious practices of revivalism, Kumina, and of course, let us not leave out Rastafari, which also, even though Rastafari men and women go against the whole philosophy of a religion based on colonial definitions, they regard themselves as a spiritual practice, which is equally African in their ethos. Now, there are commonalities between all of these religious practices. One, they show strong African connections and harbor African cultural memory, which is important. They are religions of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this is important because when Africans sought to reject colonial religious systems, reject colonial faith-based systems, they formed their own religion based on what they remember from Africa as their point of origin. No, I'm just going to go through a few photos here. This is a photo of a voodoo practice happening in Haiti. And I just want you to make note mentally of the sort of rituals that are taking place in these practices. This is a photo from Santeria, one of the Santeria practitioners in Cuba. This is a photo showing practitioners in Brazil under the religious form candomblé. And now let us get to why we're here. Revivalism. What is revivalism? If you come to Jamaica and you speak to the ordinary Jamaican, you will hear all sorts of um, um, information about what revivalism is. You'll hear that it's a demonic practice. You will hear that it's a practice not of God. You will hear that it's a practice that, you know, the lower socioeconomic class of Jamaica practices. You will hear all sorts of things, right? To the point where between the 1860s to the 1930s in Jamaica, there were all sorts of efforts happening to ban or get rid of the African-derived practices right across the Caribbean. And so even in 1931 in Jamaica, a bill was proposed by the parish council in Westmoreland and other parish councils across the Caribbean to ban the practice of revivalism on the grounds that it contributed to madness or rather lunacy within the island. And of course, this was a rhetoric because the colonial masters did not understand this sort of spiritual expression, and therefore they deemed it as madness. And if you look within our records, during the time of revivalism, the numbers of the mental asylum, the numbers of those being put into mental asylums skyrocketed. So once you practice any sort of African-derived religious tradition, you were immediately regarded as a lunatic. Once you committed any sort of crime under the colonial government, you were immediately sent to the mental asylum, right? And therefore, the numbers really grew during that time. And we understand through our research today that madness or lunacy was legally defined rather than medically defined. So there weren't any medical assessment being done of Black men and women being registered within the system. So that's another issue that I'm also working on via an article as well. This is an image of a revival group in one of their spiritual sites in Jamaica called Wat Town. Wat Town is a rural community found in the parish of St. Anne. And each quarter, the first quarter of the year being the most popular, revivalists from all across the island and the diaspora would travel or journey to this particular site called Wat Town to engage in communal worship, to engage in a sort of social bonding, and just to learn about the tenets of the religion. Revivalism carries on the tradition of orality. So a lot of the knowledge-based systems within this particular religion is passed on orally from generation to generation. And that is why the Jamaica Memory Bank is so important, because the Jamaica Memory Bank, in a sense, captures the stories of these individuals, to then share it with the rest of the nation and the world by extension. Now, revivalism emerged in Jamaica during the early 1860s. And there, out of a great revival that happened, that began in North America, traveled to Europe, and then it found its way to Jamaica via missionaries. And of course, when this happened, the revivalisms that happened, they were described as a moment in which people started to confess their sins. People fell to the ground with their confessions, talking about their sinful ways. The records show from the Jamaica archives that the membership within churches, particularly the Moravian church, went up significantly. And therefore, when this happened, Africans or people of African descent sought to merge their African spirituality with elements of Christianity. And out of that syncretic formation, there came revivalism and other spiritual practices as well. Now, the era was a period in which there was a great spiritual awakening and the mushrooming of many African religions that were suppressed and otherwise criminalized during the enslavement period. Now, this is an image showing a structure of the revival pantheon, yes? Now, within revivalism, there are two branches known as 60 Zion and 61 Revival. The main difference between these two forms is that 60 Zion is considered to be the more Christian of the two, while 61 Revival is considered to be the more African of the two, right? 60 Zion tends to deal with heavenly or celestial beings, while 61 Revival tend to entertain ancestral or otherwise known as ground spirits in their rituals and in their worship. Now, there are certain beliefs within revival. So one fundamental belief is that the spiritual world and the temporal world are one. So for example, even the very clothes that revivalists wear, it is believed that those garments are informed by the spirit. So in other words, they would get the colors, the style of the clothing through dreams and visions, where particular they're known as messengers, coming to them, appearing to them in dreams and visions, telling them what to wear, right? And this is important. There are other celebratory aesthetics within the movement. So there energetic singing, forceful drumming, dancing in a counterclockwise motion. There's a heavy emphasis on spirit possession, or what Jamaicans call getting into the spirit, within their worship, right? And these practices hold true to a sort of identity, linking them to African practices. Now, there are what is called or described as entertaining symbols in revivalism. So, music, dance, and drumming are all done to call or to entertain spirits. Yes, so these elements are done with a purpose, similar to when certain tribes in Africa do particular, whether it be fertility dance or a rain dance to bring rain during drought. So everything within African spirituality has a purpose, and it is the purpose within which these elements are done. Drumming, of course, is significant, and we know of the law that was passed, banning drumming within the Caribbean. And even though drumming was banned, of course, this religious practice continued. Now, in revivalism, there's a lot of chanting and guttural sounds happening. And the theorists or scholars agree that the sounds that revivalists make or the chants that are being done is in fact to mimic the sound of the drum, as a way of dealing with the legality around the criminalization of drumming as the main source of African expression and spirituality. I spoke about dreams and visions earlier, the importance of that, because it is through dreams and visions that spirits communicate, with the living, communicate with human beings, and so on. Now, in the early literature, being done by Edward Siago, Martha Beckwith, and so on, is that they saw revivalists as members of society from the lower socioeconomic status. So revivalists traditionally would be higglers, laborers, farmers, fishermen, housekeepers, and so on. But that dynamic has changed. Today in revivalism, the recent census shared with us record approximately 36,000, over 36,000 revivalists in Jamaica today. And of course, of that number, you have professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and so on, being a part of this sort of religion. No, and I spoke about the perception of the religion, it being considered as superstitious, pagan, primitive, comical in their ritual behaviors. And these descriptors are descriptors coming from the colonial era, of course, where these particular spiritual practices are looked at in a particular way. Now, there are three hierarchy within revivalism when it comes on to the formation or rather the social dynamics of the religion. you have leaders which are referred to as captains, shepherds for men, or mothers for women. And of course, these mothers are important in providing a sort of care, spiritual care, in providing a sort of belonging, you know, and unity within the movement. Now, you may hear persons referring to revivalism as Pocomania also. And throughout my scholarship, throughout my presentations, I tend to steer people away from the use of the term Pocomania, in that Pocomania is a Spanish word that was used to describe the movement or the religious practices practiced by colonizers. Poco in the Spanish term meaning a little, and mania meaning madness. And I spoke earlier about the use of lunacy, about the use of the narrative of madness as a way to police and control African religious practices, right? And so the term Poco mania took root in Jamaica, and ordinary Jamaicans right across the island would refer to this term as Pocomania, meaning a little madness, because of that sort of historical trauma, that historical memory that lingers within our society today. Now, the spirit is an important element within this religion. And I spoke about the survival of Africans during plantation, the harshness of plantation life, attributing it to the belief of the spirit in sustaining who they are and sustaining their identity. So the spirit in all its essence is important, because the spirit then informs the ethos, informs the rituals and the practices of these particular religious forms. Now, in revival rituals, you have what is referred to as a prayer meeting, which is synonymous to a general worship within the Christian faith. Now, within this prayer meeting, there is an emphasis on healing. And I suspect that this emphasis on healing is coming from the colonial era. So it's not only healing the physical body, but also a kind of psychological healing that is happening. And we talk about reparations, community reparations. This is an important element within community reparations, where local people are engaging in practices, whether spiritual, social, or cultural, to heal themselves, you know, as victims of trauma. No, revivalists would have street meetings and rituals for specific purposes, such as a Thanksgiving purpose being done. They have memorials, and these memorials are normal elaborate ceremonies consisting of foods, of herbs, drumming, singing, dancing, and so on, giving thanks for the life of the deceased. Now, I spoke about clothing and the importance of clothing earlier. Now, one of the primary elements of revival dress is the turban or the head wrap, right? And that is important because the head wrap is worn to protect the head. Now, within African spirituality and with most African sculptures, you would realize that with the sculptures or the carving, the head is usually larger in proportion to the body. And that is to say that the head is the most important component or element of the body, because spiritually speaking, once the head is destroyed, then the body has no use. And therefore, the turbans are usually taken through a process of consecration to then protect the head from malevolent or external forces. Now, with the head, it is referred to as the ori, right? The mental capacity of each individual. And the turbans are worn in that regard. There are other things worn on the uniforms. It could be scissors, for example, that you use to cut fabric. It could be pencils, rulers, cords, or so on. And these are worn for a kind of utilitarian purpose, right? Now, there are cultural influences within revival. And what you will understand and appreciate is that within revivalism, there are other cultural elements that were incorporated within these practices. So when the East Indians came to Jamaica as contractual laborers in the mid 1800s, what the Africans did was to take on or adopt or take on to Indian spirituality as a form of their worship. And this image that you're looking at is an image of an African Jamaican woman wearing the madras, which was taken by East Indians to the Caribbean in their ritual ceremonies. And this ceremony being depicted here is referred to as the Indian ceremony, the Indian ritual being practiced by African Jamaicans, right? And of course, Indian spirituality is quite similar to African spirituality. And so it was very easy for them to assimilate. Are you able to see the screen? Yes, perfect, right? And of course, these are uniforms being worn by revivalists. I'll just give you a minute to just look at the uniforms while I get the charger for my device. Just a second.
Okay, that's fine. It's fascinating, isn't it? The military uniform and then the school uniform. Yeah.
Oh,
You've hopped
right.
ahead.
So in revivalism, there are two categories of uniforms worn. On the left of your screen, you'll see men in red and black dressed in a sort of military attire, right? And in my own scholarship, in talking about revival clothing, because this is what I did my dissertation on, I spoke about the issue that there's a kind of military metaphor that still lingers within revivalism as an African derived practice to indicate or suggest that there's a kind of social or spiritual war that is still happening within our society to achieve the sort of decolonization that we talk about, to achieve the sort of reparation that we talk about. And so, as Africans and people of African descent, we continue to struggle within our society that are or that still has foundations of colonialism, right? In Jamaica, we still battle with issues of identity. Where even in schools, you know, children of African descent, African Jamaicans are still being told to cut their hair, groom themselves in a particular way. We've heard cases of students, um, sorry, being in a way victimized because of their locks and so on. So we still continue to wrestle within our society. You know, on the right, what you're looking at is an element of a schoolroom or a school system metaphor, in that revivalists believe that they are spiritual children going to a spiritual school, right? To learn the spirituality behind this movement. And so they would wear certain things on their bodies as a part of their complete regalia to communicate that sort of metaphor. And as you are seeing here, if you look closely, the lady in behind the leader is holding a notebook. And the purpose of that notebook is to communicate that metaphor, that we are children going to a spiritual school. And within this notebook, she would write particular messages being given by the Spirit. Of course, not in English or in any other language, but through a system that we refer to as spirit writings. All right? No, there are tables being set in revivalism for various purposes. And these tables are done for celebration, right? And what would happen? This is referred to as a Thanksgiving table. What would happen? Individuals from right across the island and even the diaspora coming together in a ritual form to celebrate and give thanks for various things. It could be you're giving thanks for the birth of a child, the return of a loved one from prison, the recovery of an illness, and so on. And various things are placed on the table, as you can see. So fruits, vegetables, carbonated beverages, alcoholic beverages, herbs of various kinds, spices, and so on. And these tables are set in various shapes and forms and for various purposes. No, there are warding off what are referred to as warding off symbols. No, I'm when it comes to Jamaica, and if you go to certain parts of rural Jamaica, you will see mothers or fathers tying a piece of red string or putting a piece of red ribbon in the hair or around the wrist of their child. And that is within a Jamaican philosophy that the color red is used to ward off evil spirits. And so that is still held in place within revival practices in Jamaica. And even if you if you study Chinese spirituality, you'll also understand that the color red, representing fire, is used to keep away evil spirits or malevolent forces, right? And there are healing symbols, as I mentioned to you before. Healing is important in revivalism. And this image that you're looking at is a revival seal that is used for healing purposes. And in this image, there are various elements that are used to construct a seal. You can see flags or banners, pieces of fabric stitched to create flags. You can see, for example, a basin of water and other herbs and spices that are used in in healing. There are other seals that are used. So there are external seal, with the seal which you've just looked at, and there's the internal seal which is being shown now. And water is an important element within the healing practices of revivalism. There are other elements. This is an image of a revival church in Wat Town, St. Anne. And of course, there are banners used with particular wording taken from the scripture or so on. These are colors and their representation or meaning. The color green is used in healing rituals because the color green is used to represent the herbs of the field and so on. The sense of community is important within revival rituals and so on. So you will find revivalists traveling across the island to support each other. The kind of communal bonding and solidarity that is driven, that is communicated within these communities are quite important and admirable, if you ask me. So they do support each other, and you'll find a sense of community as a major theme going across African spiritual practices throughout the Caribbean. So that is a nutshell. I will end there. Thank you. Of what revivalism is, and in a brief way, the elements of revivalism. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kurt Henry. That was absolutely riveting. Wow, gosh. Well done, and applause there from Simon saying thank you. And thank you very much for presenting it so clearly with such great slides and such great photos. It really does help to get a better understanding. Thank you so much. Absolutely fabulous. Okay then, so we've got Garrick maybe thinking about coming up with a response. Garrick?
Yes, firstly, just to say thank you very much for the way you've presented the subject matter and the background, the context to revivalism. Interesting enough, and I think you and I had this conversation last year because while you was here, you know, as a young person growing up, my grandparents, my grandma, are maroons, so we're coming from those traditions, and you know, I learned a lot from my grandmother, all verbal, oral, nothing written on paper or written on stone, and also in my district, you know, I observe the practices of various religious groups, particularly how the Pecamania people would perform. And when we were children, growing up and seeing how they would get into a spirit and fall over and utter you know, utterances that nobody could understand. We didn't understand what that was all about. Later in years, we got a sense of that. And you make reference to an interesting point about how the two came together from the African tradition and how some of the Christian things came in and merged together. And of course, evidence of this can be seen in Pentecostal church movement and Church of God movement. You can see some of these elements. So I think, you know, what you're emphasizing in terms of where this came from, and in particular, you talk about our ancestors, and you know, often you will hear the expression, if you go to a particular place that you've never been before, you don't know why you were taken to this place, but you feel something in this place, as if the ancestors actually brought you here and is speaking to you. There's a feeling in this place. And on the 23rd of August every year, we have the libation, which is again a practice from our ancestors. And that is UNESCO remembering slavery as an important date in the calendar, August 23rd. And that is when we actually perform the libation and then give recognition to our ancestors, that journey that they've gone through and where we are in time.
Thank you. If I may just respond quickly, Liz, is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
I'm happy. 2 points I picked out from your response to me, Garrick. One, I forgot to mention that the pilgrimage to Wat Town was inscribed on UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage for humanity. That was done last year in December. So in various ways, the ministry and ACIJ celebrated that as an important milestone in bringing the sort of global recognition. And what I need to mention as well is that revivalism today is not only practiced in Jamaica. Revival churches are found in England, for example.
Yes.
In North America, in Panama, because, you know, Jamaicans left Jamaica during the Panama Canal era, went there and they brought their religion with them. The second point I would like to comment on is the issue of spirit possession or getting in the spirit, and you mentioned people falling to the ground and so on. for many Africans, because they could not return to Africa physically, they use the spirit as a way in which to travel back to Africa, right? And so a lot of the tenets of the religion was birthed out of that kind of journey across the Atlantic spiritually, to then remember, you know, the sort of rituals and practices um, is African in its ethos, you know? And that is why most Africans on the plantation, in fact, did not consume salt, because there was a belief that the salt would trap the spirit from going back. And that is why, again, in many spiritual circles, salt is not used within particular spiritual rituals, you know? And I'm sure you're aware of Kumina, which is another
Yes.
African-derived religious practice, where the story of the former Kumina queen, Imogene Kennedy, is told, in that she was in a trance for a long time. And during that trance-like state, the ancestors brought her back to Africa and taught her the language of the Congolese people. Now, this is a woman who has never left Jamaica in her earlier years, have never been to Africa. And scholars were able to come and interview her and confirm that this is actually the Congolese language. So one of my emphasis here is that quite often scholars disregard the importance of spirituality, disregard the importance of the spirit as an agent within the constant decolonization that is happening. It is in fact the spirit of the people that has brought over practices like revivalism, and that has really kept the population of enslaved Africans intact psychologically and, of course, physically.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, really, really informative, and interesting enough, what you've said in terms of, how it was preserved, and you can find evidence of this, throughout the continents. Wherever you go, you'll find that, because there is no place globally where African hasn't been. So, practices are everywhere. Yeah.
It was just fascinating to hear this, and to have your comment as well, Garrick, and your response also, Kurt. Really quite incredible. As you said earlier, Kurt, this is something that is not revivalism. It isn't well understood. As you know, perhaps I know a little bit more about Rastafari through my work with Yassus Afari. But certainly revivalism is something that seems to me needs to be better understood and better and appreciated, accepted. It is what it is, and it certainly has many psychological implications as your people's rationalize. How can you ever rationalize what's happened in history to African people who were transported over to the New World, as it was called, to the Caribbean, North and South America? So it's just been absolutely fascinating to hear about this, and you just portrayed it so clearly. Thank you so much, Kurt. Thank you very,
Uh,
very much indeed.
If I could just
you
ask
are
one
most
one
welcome.
other question, please,
Yeah.
Kurt, because many religious group will always have some form of written code that they would use. So with revivalism, is there any guidance, any written code that is used? I mean, what you stress is that it's been coming down orally through generation, etc. But in terms of certain things, I guess there must be some guidance in terms of code.
Right. That's an interesting question. And a lot of the and I like how you use the term code, because a lot of the codes are found in the elements of the religion. For example, their seals. For example, the writings on their banners. For example, the interpretation of colors. So once a revivalist see a particular color, they immediately knows, right, what it means. So the codes of these religious practices are not necessarily found in European standard ways of writing, but through the various signs and symbols
Yeah.
that they use to communicate with each other. And speaking on that matter, just let me bring back your attention. If you look at this image closely, and if you look on the ground, you'll see a sort of seal, right?
Yeah.
And that seal is called a veve. And that veve is not only used as a portal for the spirits to be present, but it is also a coded language which is used to communicate with those of the religion, not outsiders now, but those within the religion. And that is one of the reasons why revivalism and many African derived religious practices are misunderstood, because a lot of the codes are only to be found internally. And when you're researching these things, do not underestimate the power of ethnographic work. You have to be in it to understand it and and to write about it, right? And,
Yeah.
and another point, Liz mentioned earlier, Rastafari. So revivalism emerged in the early 1860s. Rastafari, rather, did not emerge until the 1930s.
Yeah.
And particular scholarship will show you that many of the early founding fathers of Rastafari were revivalists, were Kumina practitioners. So even in Rastafari, there are a lot of elements of revivalism found in Rastafari. And Clinton Hutton has written an exceptional article on this comparison between Rastafari and revivalism. So there are a lot of
Did you say
historical
Clinton Hutton? Clinton Hutton?
Clinton, yes, Clinton Hutton.
Okay.
I can send the article, share the article
Yeah.
with the group,
Yeah.
talking about those links and connections.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for that lead as well. Just so that you're aware, Kurt, we're now reviving our website, Black History Conversations, trying to rationalize it a little, which over 150 sessions is quite difficult. But specifically, a session like this, with some additional references, articles, anything else you want to add, we will feature on the website. And I think this is a really, really important way of us being able to help you to share perhaps a better understanding about
Right.
that. And here we are. Here we've got
Yeah.
the references
Yes.
right in front of our face. So thank you very much indeed, and also the Clinton Hutton reference as well. Gosh,
Right.
there are several here. So yeah, that's great.
C.S. Lewis is also mentioned there, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Will you just be patient with me? Am I able to take screenshots of this so that we can? That would be
Oh,
great.
absolutely. Or I could send you a more comprehensive list via email, if that's okay.
That would be great. That would really
Yes.
be great, because it is important that we, we ask people to give of their time, which you've done today, and it's important that we we respect the knowledge that you've shared, and that knowledge can be shared on with others with further information. I'm finding this whole experience in my life fascinating as I explore our shared history, and thank you so much, Dr. Kurt Henry. It's just your support has been magnificent, both today with this information, but also you joined us on our Exploring Our Shared History program just a couple of weeks back,
Yes.
to be able to tell us about the work that of the Jamaica Memory Bank, and that's been so helpful. So we're really beginning to get into having a significant contribution to make to help people understand and dip in and out in a non-formal sort of way. We're really into non-formal learning, but as a formal learning experience, this session has been absolutely magnificent and presented so well. I thank you very, very much indeed then. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up now. It's just on 3 o'clock our time. I think that's 9 o'clock your time, is it? Thank you very much for your morning. That's been great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Simon, are you able to stop the recording?